thank you all for being here, and to the First Nations on whose territory we find ourselves tonight, the Wolastoqey or Maliseet people, I say Walalan, thank you for your generosity and hospitality. I'm really enormously honored to be invited by my alma mater, in the sense that I was so very honored to receive an honorary doctorate from the University of New Brunswick, to be invited here to the law faculty to speak on a topic which is on my mind pretty much constantly. I titled this talk 1.5 to Stay Alive many, many months ago. But we had just seen the IPCC report come out. It was October 8th, 2018, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a special report, special in the sense that they had been asked to prepare it by the negotiations and the negotiators in Paris in 2015. We had negotiated a treaty which set 1.5 as the average, global average temperature above which we must not go. So the Paris Agreement says that the world's nations working together will reduce greenhouse gases to the level to ensure that we don't go above, and this is a terrible target. This is how long it takes to just say the minimum target. And at that negotiation, the world governments also asked the scientific advisory body to all governments, and that's what it is, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, created in 1988, in order to advise policymakers about the evidence as it came forward, what we needed to do to avoid climate disaster. The phrase 1.5 to stay alive came to me when I was looking at the IPCC report, because that's literally what they've told us. And I'll come back to that. But the first time I heard that phrase had been in 2009 in the negotiations that failed. The negotiations in Copenhagen, where we had gathered to negotiate the successor agreement to Kyoto. By the way, Kyoto didn't fail. Most of the governments that took on commitments under Kyoto achieved their targets or exceeded them. It's only in Canada and the US that it is routinely dismissed as though it wasn't successful. But most nations kept their commitments under Kyoto. In 2009 in Copenhagen, we were gathered to negotiate what will follow, because Kyoto's targets ended in 2012, and we obviously have to continue to reduce greenhouse gases. Kyoto was at the time referred to as a down payment on future action. And the first conference on the human environment was way back in Sweden, in Stockholm, in 1972. But Stockholm is largely remembered for the fact that in 1972 it was very hard to convince developing nations that a concern for the environment was anything other than a rich country's issue that was not meaningful to them. Now, by 1992 at the Earth Summit, there was a very marked change. Number one, a conference on the environment and development. That's an important aspect. It was framed around sustainable development goals, framed around environment and development, but a country that had boycotted 20 years earlier hosted, because it was the Rio Earth Summit. So Brazil was hosting a gathering of nations to talk about environment and development and these twin threats. It was at Rio in June 92 that the fundamental legal document, the international treaty within which all our other actions has been framed, was signed. So that was the Rio bargain that buttressed the fact that every nation on Earth came and signed on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There was that sort of arc of global negotiations that now we had a deal. Developing countries were on board for climate targets, just as they'd been on board for protecting our ozone layer in the 1987 Montreal Protocol, because we recognized that there was a pact to be made, that the issues north and south were different. But the negotiations in Copenhagen were typified by bad faith bargaining. In Copenhagen, suddenly, every nation from the African continent stood up and walked out, joined by every nation that qualified as a low-lying island state, stood up and marched out, and they all were chanting 1.5 to stay alive. And they literally meant it. For low-lying island states to stay above the waterline, global average temperature could not go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. They knew this, they chanted it, joined by African nations that recognized that development isn't possible when you go through long periods of drought followed by a year's rainfall in a month that washes away all the soil, that washes away any prospect of making progress in terms of development. We were hearing the global South saying very clearly, this is an existential threat to us. If you don't hold it at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will not survive as nations. And in that walkout, that very dramatic, it doesn't happen much in UN negotiations, that whole blocks of countries, as a matter of fact, I'd never seen it anywhere before or since, the whole blocks of nations stand up and walk out together. The alliance that formed in that moment was low-lying island states, the developing nations, the poorest of the poor of Africa, joined and supported by their allies, the youth of the world. Every young person, every youth-led NGO stood up and walked out with them, chanting, 1.5 to stay alive. So when we come to 1.5 to stay alive, who else is saying it besides low-lying island states, the poorest of the poor, our children, our elders? We're also hearing it from our scientists. But the scientists are telling us that if we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, we run far too high a risk of unleashing something we can't stop. We can't keep burning fossil fuels because as we burn fossil fuels, we create conditions which start triggering events with positive feedback loops. So, for instance, when 400 forest fires burned this summer in interior British Columbia, every single forest fire released the carbon that had been sequestered through photosynthesis through the life of that forest. So the warmer water was melting Arctic ice. The positive feedback loop is that the ice on our Arctic creates something called the albedo effect. The ice cap creates, through its whiteness, the sun's rays and the heat of the sun are largely bounced back to space when they hit ice. But when the ice has melted and dark ocean water has opened up, the sun's radiative heat is sucked into the ocean, thus heating the water more, melting the ice faster, and creating a positive feedback loop to heat the water more, melt the ice faster. The positive feedback loop that scares me the most is the melting permafrost. Permafrost, as you can imagine, is that ground that is permanently frozen, but what was it before it froze? It was largely muskeg. It was swampy stuff. And so what we have frozen in permafrost is a lot of methane gas. So as the permafrost melts, it releases methane, further speeding up the heating process with the risk of melting more permafrost. Scientists have calculated that if we were to lose all of the Earth's permafrost, if we let it melt, it will release 4 times more greenhouse gases than everything released by humanity since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's super important to keep the Arctic as cold as possible. What is the difference between 1.5 and 2, and can we still hold to 1.5? And what the scientists told us, which is really good news, is we can hold to 1.5. The part that's discomforting is, oh yes, and if we fail to do that and go to 2, we're looking at the potential for the collapse of human civilization or worse. Only Fiji and the Marshall Islands improved their targets at COP24. So here we are in 2019 in my country that I love, that was in 1988 in the lead in acting for climate action. We hosted the first Global Climate Science Conference. We helped host and support the first global climate target. I'm not going to bore you with the number of targets that Canada has said we will hit and that we never tried to hit. They pile up behind us and they give, strangely enough, perversely enough, they allow people that I know now in places of power in Ottawa to say targets don't matter because we don't hit them. Yeah, you know. The target to save the ozone layer worked. We lived up to it. We hit it. And as a result, the world is now not debating what to do about the loss of the ozone layer and the UV rays that are reaching crops and frying them and killing people with excess cancers. We now celebrate, as we should, that the ozone layer is repairing itself. Targets work if you have the political will to meet them, if you pay attention, if you set a target that is consistent with what must be done. We set targets and we hit them, and we were guided by science. It's only been on the issue of climate change that world resolve has been so desperately weakened by deliberate campaigns of disinformation by big oil. It's very clear that that's what happened. If we had acted in '92 on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, if we'd hit the target Canada had set, if we'd led the world to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, we could have prevented the things that are now no longer preventable. We are now locked in, because we are now at 1 degree Celsius, global average temperature 1 degree Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. And we're on track for sure to hit 1.5, and it will take something of a miracle to hold it at 1.5. Canada's current target, well, before I move to Canada, collectively, all the countries on Earth, the current collection of targets, if followed and executed on time by every country on Earth, the collection of governmental promises, if delivered, take us to somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 degrees Celsius. So that's why the IPCC was quite forthright. Need to pay attention. This is a wake-up call. We need to reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases by 45% below 2010 levels, and we need to make sure it's done by 2030. That doesn't mean we have 12 years. That means we have no time at all, because the scale of work that will be required to achieve a 45% reduction in greenhouse gases globally, that scale of work was described by IPCC scientists as transformative, Herculean, unlike anything we've ever seen human society accomplish. Now, in that context, we come to the question, finding hope and honesty in dangerous times. We surely cannot survive if we don't embrace the reality that we will. We have to, at all levels of government, all aspects of society, in all countries and all ages, have to decide we've got this one chance. We've got a chance to ensure that we stop relying on fossil fuels as quickly as possible, that we replant forests. We've got to replant trees everywhere. We've got to do everything we can for sequestration, that we transform our economy from one that's been dependent on fossil fuels to something else. Now, there's lots of good news in that the something else's we need are all invented. We don't have to wish and hope, oh, if only we had an alternative to fossil fuels. Everywhere you look, with the exception of jet fuel for our airplanes, everywhere you look in society, there is a replacement for fossil fuels. So somehow we have to figure out how to be honest about the threat, hopeful in inspiring each other every single day that we actually have the tools we need to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. We know we can. We've been told by the IPCC we can. And yet here we are in Canada in 2019, and of all the targets I've mentioned that we stacked up and missed, we're now clinging to the one that was the weakest one ever selected. Stephen Harper's third. Stephen Harper weakened our climate target 3 times. We are now still under the regime that Canada's climate action is to reach Stephen Harper's third and weakest target, 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. So we need as a country, and this is where I get excited about the potential, COP25, God help us, 25 years of climate conferences after the negotiation of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I brought my baby to the Rio Earth Summit. She couldn't walk yet. She's been working on her PhD now. She's made a heck of a lot more progress than the world's governments ever since we met in Rio in 1992. We have to stop allowing governments to ones that create the most jobs by changing our economy and ensuring that we have things like efficient rail service, ensuring that we have things like an electricity grid fueled by nothing but renewable energy, and ensuring that our businesses, institutional, residential, commercial, are all operating in a way that means they generate their own power instead of wasting energy by heating the outdoors in the winter and cooling the outdoors in the summer. This is all possible. So finding honesty in dangerous times is hard enough because nobody in the political world, well, except I guess me, nobody that I debate in Parliament on a daily basis wants to face these facts. So we do need some basic education, and that education may end up happening in Canada during an election campaign. But what I wanted to share with you today, and then I want to open the floor to questions virtually immediately, is this. We can get through this. We can hug our babies at night and know that they have a secure future, whether they're our babies or our grandbabies or our nieces or our nephews. What kind of generation would condemn their children, their babies, to an unlivable world within their lifetime? I am not exaggerating. It is not hyperbole. This is what we're facing. An unlivable world within the lifespan of our children. We must respond without partisanship, without rancor. We must reach out and love absolutely everyone we can, as much as we can, all the time, and say, come with me. We've got solar panels to put on our roofs. We've got some trees to plant. And we've got some big oil to shut down. Thank you.
You said the goal, the target should be 1.5. And you said if the whole world, the countries of the world keep to their promise, we can only achieve 2.5 to 3.5. So if that is the case, it's still bleak. So what's the solution?
Every country on Earth has to ratchet up its target to be consistent with what the IPCC has said. And by the way, I think we should assume, because it's always been the case, that the IPCC advice is giving us more time than we actually have. So the more aggressive the targets, the better. The faster we act, the better. And we can do this because a lot of the technologies that I mentioned we have are beating down the doors to get in.
Hi. I work on women's rights, and one thing that I was interested in as the debates about the pipeline were happening is the discussion about gender effects and the sexual violence that occurs on pipeline crews, et cetera, that particularly affects Indigenous women. And the government was almost, it seemed, universally mocked for even bringing that up. So my question for you is, what do you see as the gender impacts about our reliance on fossil fuel and climate change?
There's a gender issue there. Women are the major producers of food around the world are on low-scale, small farms, women farmers. Women are, as caregivers, more often than not, the people looking after the displaced. So we're going to be seeing, depending on whether we hold to 1.5 or go beyond it, we're going to be seeing somewhere between hundreds of thousands or millions of environmental refugees. Women are always in a situation of trying to care for people, internally displaced people, refugees on the march. Women are displaced. Women are also carrying the load. At the same time, as you talk about resource camps, there's no question that the Trail of Tears runs along in a number of places where Indigenous women and murdered and missing Indigenous women. The evidence has been at least suggestive that there is a proximity to work camps. The work that was done was often done by, probably majority very, very decent people. I'm not going to get into that. What it's clear is on the evidence is that, and I remember being in Fort McMurray on an environmental assessment hearing on the Shell Jackpine mine, and the local doctors were testifying that in those work camps, they saw every form of trauma, they saw every form of abuse, they saw drug use and violence and trauma. I know that I will be hearing from the same people to whom Justin Trudeau wrongfully apologized instead of amassing the evidence and explaining that what he said was true.
What can we do to make those who don't believe find this a more appealing solution and something that they can adapt into their lives?
If you have neighbors, friends, really grumpy uncles who don't understand why you're worried about climate change, keep talking to them. Express what you understand about the science clearly. Give them books to read. Don't write them off. Keep explaining it and explaining it. So don't give up on people and don't stay in an echo chamber.
I know that nuclear power, nuclear energy is one technology that is very clean in terms of carbon emissions. So I was just wondering, what is like the number one or some of the biggest barriers to scaling up our use of nuclear energy?
It takes a long time to build a new reactor. It takes a long time to retube one. Look at Point Lepreau and the money on that. What we really need to do is move with those technologies that can be start to finish, reduce greenhouse gases as fast as possible, creating as many jobs as possible. Those technologies are now solar. Solar is now cheaper than coal. Then you also can look at wind energy. Wind energy is fast uptake and has a very, very good impact quickly. The piece of technology that's really the most exciting right now is how we have storage of renewable energy, because we have more than enough renewable energy all around the world, no question. How do we store it so when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, we've got it? Now, there's a lot of really cool research being done in a new generation of battery power. But, how do we store this energy? If we think about large batteries, that's one thing. And unfortunately, another thing about nuclear energy is it embeds something that I'm hoping we're going to get rid of. We can democratize energy in the transition away from fossil fuels so that we no longer are dependent on a large mega project with wires stretching in all directions. We can in a subdivision, we can in a small community, we can in an apartment building, we can in a university, generate all the power that that institution needs locally. But it also makes sense to democratize energy, and nuclear power stands in the way of that. I deeply want to be able to share honesty and hope at the same time, because we have to save ourselves. It's unacceptable to think otherwise. Thank you.